April 19, 1945. 4:47 a.m. Somewhere in Bavaria. The bridge shouldn't have mattered. Hauptmann Klaus Meisner stood at the eastern approach, watching fog roll across the Danube tributary nobody had bothered to name. Behind him, 46 men, deserters, cowards, thieves pulled from military prisons across the Reich, checked weapons they barely knew how to use. In 6 hours, American armor would arrive. The standing order was clear. Blow the bridge, fall back, disappear into the chaos of a dying empire. Meisner held the detonator. He didn't press it. Think about that for a second. A German officer, April 1945, Hitler dead in 3 weeks, holding the device that would complete his final mission. The smart play, the obvious play. The play that gets you home alive. He threw it in the river instead. By April 1945, the European theater had devolved into something historians politely call fluid. The truth was uglier. Complete systemic collapse. The Wehrmacht was a zombie army still moving, still dangerous, but already dead. From the Elbe to the Alps, 4.8 million German soldiers were executing contradictory orders from commanders who'd lost contact with reality. Hold the line meant nothing when there was no line. Defend to the last man was impossible when half your men had already vanished into the countryside, burying their uniforms and inventing new identities. The American Third Army was pushing east at speeds that embarrassed their own logistics officers. Patton's armor units were covering 70 miles a day through territory. German High Command still colored red on maps drawn 3 weeks earlier. Intelligence estimated they'd reach the Austrian border by May 1st. They were wrong by 11 days. What slowed them wasn't heroic resistance. It was mathematics. Every bridge demolished added 6 to 18 hours time to find engineers, equipment, alternative crossings. Time measured in American lives at subsequent river crossings, where German stragglers would make final stands. The Allies had a solution. Move so fast, the Germans couldn't destroy infrastructure. Speed as strategy, it was working brilliantly. Except nobody had accounted for Bridge 471K. That wasn't its real designation. It didn't have one. On April 18, 1945, this particular crossing over a Danube feeder stream 40 kilometers south of Regensburg existed in a cartographic void. American maps labeled it possible minor crossing. German maps showed nothing at all. 7 kilometers of forest road connected it to anything resembling a main route, which is precisely why it mattered. SS Gruppenführer Brenner understood topology better than most. As Allied forces pushed toward Munich, re-echelon units, the administrators, the specialists. The trucks full of documents nobody wanted captured needed escape routes. The Americans wouldn't prioritize. Bridge 471K was perfect. Too small for strategic concern. Too remote for immediate attention. Exactly large enough for desperate traffic. On April 12, Brenner diverted critical assets toward this forgotten crossing. Medical personnel carrying typhus research. Accountants with ledgers detailing concentration camp economics. 2 trucks containing records from Dachau 39 kilometers north. Not the infamous prisoner documentation, the administrative files. The paperwork that would answer questions about who knew what and when. 7 days to move the convoy. The bridge had to stand until April 19th, then vanish as if it never existed. For this mission, Brenner couldn't use regular troops. They were too recognizable, too likely to surrender the moment Americans appeared. He needed men with nothing to lose. Men the system had already condemned. He got them from Strafbattalion 999. Nobody volunteers for a penal battalion. You're sent there. Strafbattalion 999 was where the Wehrmacht disposed of soldiers who'd committed crimes. Just serious enough to merit something worse than prison, but not quite bad enough for immediate execution. Desertion, insubordination, theft, political unreliability. Since 1942, they'd been deployed to the ugliest corners of the Eastern Front, performing suicidal mine-clearing operations and human wave attacks designed to locate enemy positions through attrition. Survival rate, 23%. By April 1945, the battalion had been ground down to scattered remnants. The 46 men assigned to Bridge 471K represented the dregs of the dregs. Their commander was their punishment. Hauptmann Klaus Meisner, 31 years old, veteran of France, Russia, and North Africa. Brilliant tactical officer. Iron Cross, First Class. Court-martialed in February 1945 for refusing to execute French civilians accused of partisan activity in Alsace. The charges: cowardice in the face of the enemy and conduct unbecoming. His sentence: commands Strafbattalion remnants until killed in action. Meisner arrived at the bridge on April 16th, with men who hated him for being there. Jailer and hated themselves for still being alive. No heavy weapons, no fortifications. 4 MG4 to machine guns, 42 car 98K rifles, 2 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, ammunition for maybe 90 minutes of sustained combat, and orders to hold for 72 hours minimum. The convoy would arrive April 18th, cross during darkness. By dawn, April 19th, Meisner was to destroy the bridge and lead his men west, where theoretically they'd rejoin German lines. Everyone understood the subtext. They were never rejoining anything. This was execution with extra steps. What Brenner didn't know: Meisner had stopped following orders from people he didn't respect. April 17th, evening. Meisner sent 3 men into the forest on reconnaissance. Standard practice: know your terrain, understand approach routes, identify where the Americans would come from. They returned with something unexpected: civilians. 14 people, emerging from a farmhouse 6 kilometers north. 12 adults, 2 children under 5. They'd been hiding there since February, subsisting on stored food, waiting for the war to pass them by. Now, American artillery was getting closer. They needed to cross the bridge, head south, toward anything resembling safety. Meisner's orders were explicit: no civilian traffic. The bridge existed for one purpose only. He let them cross anyway. Then he walked the bridge himself, inspecting demolition charges placed by engineers 3 days earlier. Plastic explosives at 4 load-bearing points, simple electrical detonation system, backup manual fuses. Professional work. The bridge would drop clean into the river. Nothing but twisted metal and shattered stone. He noticed something while checking the charges. The sound. Most officers wouldn't have registered it. Meisner had spent 18 months on the Eastern Front, where survival meant processing sensory information most people filtered out. The particular groan of stressed metal. The frequency shift when something's carrying more weight than designed for. The bridge was rated for 12 tons. The convoy Brenner was sending included trucks that, fully loaded, weighed 19. Someone had done the math wrong, or more likely, hadn't done it at all. Either way, the bridge would hold for the crossing, then probably collapse naturally within weeks from structural fatigue, unless something heavier tried to cross first. American Sherman tanks weighed 33 tons. Meisner stood there, doing calculations in his head. If Americans reached the bridge and attempted crossing, the structure would fail. They'd lose equipment, probably men. They'd be delayed days, possibly while engineers constructed a replacement, which meant the convoy would have time to reach alternative crossings, which meant the documents would escape, which meant the people responsible for Dachau, for the medical experiments, for everything documented in those trucks, would disappear into Austria, then South America, then history's footnotes. He'd spent 3 years following orders he increasingly couldn't stomach, following them because the alternative was execution, following them because individual officers couldn't change the trajectory of industrial genocide. Here, on this unnamed bridge, one individual could. If he did, nothing just followed orders, blew the bridge, fell back, the convoy escaped. If he did something insane, something tactically indefensible, something that would get him and his men killed, those documents stayed in Germany. Most officers would have destroyed the bridge and moved on. Most officers would have rationalized it as duty. But Meisner wasn't following orders from people who'd turned warfare into assembly line murder. He threw the detonator in the river and called his men together. If you're finding this story as compelling as we did, hit that subscribe button. There are dozens more untold stories like this waiting to be discovered. April 18th, 600 hours. We're holding the bridge, Meisner announced. Silence, then laughter. Bitter, disbelieving laughter from men who'd stopped expecting anything except death. Against the Americans, Feldwebel Ernst Koller, the senior NCO, 43 years old, imprisoned for black market trading. Herr Hauptmann, we have 47 rifles and 4 machine guns. 46 rifles, Meisner corrected. I'll be spotting. We have ammunition for 90 minutes. Maybe. Then we hold for 90 minutes. The convoy crosses tonight. We destroy the bridge at dawn. Those are the orders. The orders, Meisner said quietly, are designed to help war criminals escape justice. That got their attention, he explained. Not everything they didn't need to know about Brenner's specific cargo, but enough. The bridge couldn't support American armor. If it stood, Americans would try to cross, the structure would fail, they'd be delayed. If it fell, Americans would ford the stream, or find another route, and arrive before the convoy cleared the area. We're not defending Germany, Meisner said. We're defending the truth. The truth, Koller said slowly, that we're all dead men anyway. Yes, here's what nobody tells you about condemned men. They're paradoxically free. When you've accepted death, strategy changes. The goal isn't survival, it's meaning. Meisner gave them a choice. Follow orders, blow the bridge, fall back, die slowly in the chaos, or make their final stand matter. Hold the bridge, delay American armor, ensure the convoy was caught. He expected maybe a dozen volunteers. 46 hands went up, not because they were patriots, not because they believed in the Reich, because for the first time since their courts-martial, someone was offering them a chance to be something other than criminals. They had 14 hours to prepare. You don't defeat American armor with rifles. You defeat it with terrain, psychology, and making them believe the cost exceeds the value. Meisner had studied Soviet defensive tactics, how ragged NKVD units held German advances through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. The principle was simple. Make every meter cost blood. Make the enemy decide this particular objective isn't worth the casualties. But he had to make Americans decide that about a bridge that officially didn't matter. The bridge itself was stone and steel, 47 meters long, 4.2 meters wide. Single lane, forested approaches on both sides. The eastern approach climbing a gentle slope, western side descending toward the stream. Meisner positioned the machine guns in interlocking fields of fire, dug into the tree line where muzzle flash would be harder to spot. To covering the eastern approach the direction Americans would come from, 2 aimed at the bridge itself, to engage anything that made it past the first line. Rifle positions in a crescent, 40 meters back from the bridge's eastern edge, close enough to engage, far enough to make American return fire less accurate. They had no mines, so they created obstacles. Felled trees across the approach road, forcing vehicles to slow. Dug shallow trenches, not deep enough to stop tanks, but enough to make drivers cautious. Then Meisner did something unexpected. He sent Koller with 5 men to the western side of the bridge, positioned them in the forest, hidden, with strict orders. Observe only. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Why? Koller asked. Because when this starts, Americans will assume we're on the eastern side only. Standard defensive posture. They'll focus their fire there, try to flank north or south. When they do, you radio back what you see. We adjust. We have 1 radio. Then you better take care of it. It wasn't much of a plan. Against a properly equipped American infantry company, they'd last maybe 20 minutes. Against armor less, but Meisner wasn't planning to face a full assault. He was planning to be so much of a nuisance that American commanders decided to go around. The convoy arrived at 2,100 hours. 6 trucks, moving slowly, headlights off, drivers navigating by moonlight. Meisner watched from the eastern tree line as they crossed. The bridge groaned that same sound he'd noticed before. Stressed metal protesting weight it wasn't designed for but held. 19 minutes for the full convoy to cross. At 21:19 hours, the last truck disappeared into the forest. At 2,120 hours, Meisner heard the first American engine. They came at dawn, April 19th, 0547 hours. 3 Sherman tanks, 1 M8 Greyhound armored car, 2 jeeps, scout element from the American 11th Armored Division, probing east after receiving reports of possible bridge structure from aerial reconnaissance. Standard American doctrine. Scouts investigate, confirm crossing point radio back, wait for main force if resistance encountered. Meisner let them get close. 400 meters, 300, 200. The lead Sherman stopped 150 meters from the bridge. Commander visible in the turret, scanning with binoculars. Meisner understood the thought process. Bridge looks intact. No visible defenders. Probably retreating Germans blew the charges wrong or ran out of time. Send the Greyhound across first lighter. Faster, can reverse if problems appear. The Greyhound rolled forward. At 100 meters, Meisner fired a single shot from his car, 98K. Deliberately high, deliberately loud, the Greyhound stopped. Now the Americans had a decision tree. Defended bridge means a bypass and report. B. Suppress and investigate. Or C. Call for infantry support and assault properly. They chose B. The Shermans opened fire. 75mm high explosive shells screaming into the tree line, where Meisner's shot had originated. Absolutely devastating. Trees exploding into splinters. Earth fountaining upward. The physical sensation of pressure waves squeezing your lungs. Meisner's men held fire. This was critical. Fire back now. Americans would see muzzle flash, count weapons, estimate force size. Realize they're facing a token resistance. Push through. Stay silent. Let them waste ammunition on empty forest. They start wondering what they're actually facing. The bombardment lasted 4 minutes. Methodical, professional. The kind of firepower that obliterates entrenched infantry. Then, silence. The Americans waited, listening, watching for movement. Meisner counted to 60, then fired again. Different position, 40 meters south of the first shot. More shells, more devastation. This time the Shermans shifted targets, firing into the new location. Meisner moved again. He kept this up for 30 minutes. Single shots from rotating positions, forcing Americans to waste ammunition and time on phantoms. Never revealing the actual defensive line. Never letting them fix his strength. At 0634 hours, the American commander made his decision. The Shermans withdrew 400 meters. The radio operator Meisner could see him through binoculars, was calling for support. First victory, delay achieved. Americans wouldn't try forcing the crossing until they had infantry. Meisner checked his watch. The convoy had a 37-hour head start. American reaction time, call-up of support units. Approach March. Meisner estimated 6 hours minimum before a proper assault. He'd bought time, not enough. They came back at 1300 hours. 2 full infantry platoons. For more Moon's artillery observers, smoke generators. This time, the Americans weren't probing. They were reducing. The preparatory bombardment was biblical. 105mm howitzer. Shells walking across the eastern approach in methodical patterns. Smoke rounds obscuring the bridge. The Shermans advancing under cover. Infantry following in textbook fire and movement patterns. Meisner waited until the infantry reached 75 meters. Then the machine guns opened up. 4 MG-42s, firing in 2-second bursts. Tracers ripping through smoke. The sound that particular tearing canvas raw, psychologically devastating even when you're not the target. American infantry went to ground. Combat experienced troops, moving properly, using cover. But they'd expected token resistance. Maybe a squad of stragglers. The volume of fire suggested something larger. The Shermans pushed forward, trying to suppress the machine guns with .50 cal fire. Meisner's anti-tank team engaged. 2 Panzerfausts, carefully positioned, both gunners young 22 and 19. Both imprisoned for desertion. They'd been trained on these weapons in basic 3 years ago, then never touched them again. The first shot missed. Rocket screaming past the lead Sherman, detonating in the forest beyond. The second shot hit. Impact on the Sherman's frontal armor, just below the turret ring. Not a kill-shot. American frontal armor was too thick but enough to damage the transmission. The tank stopped, unable to reverse. Crew bailed out. American infantry pulled back to regroup. Meisner assessed. Ammunition, 60% remaining. Casualties, 2 wounded. 1 seriously machine gunner named Dieter Kraus. Shrapnel through the abdomen, bleeding internally. No medic, no morphine. They laid him in a foxhole and told him to stay quiet. The Americans would come again, heavier, more systematic. But the bridge still stood, and somewhere south, the convoy was running out of road. 1,430 hours. Cleeler's voice on the radio, west side of the bridge. American scouts, south approach, 4 men on foot. Exactly what Meisner expected. While the main force fixed his attention east, scouts looking for a flanking route. Let them see the bridge. Meisner radioed back. Fire 1 burst when they're 200 meters out. Make them think you're a rearguard. Koller understood. Americans needed to believe the German force was entirely focused on the eastern approach. 1 machine gun west would suggest a small rear security element. Reasonable, not a serious obstacle. If they thought the western side was lightly held, they'd send a flanking force, which would take time to organize and maneuver through the forest. More delay. The Americans probed until 1600 hours. Mortar, machine gun fire, occasional tank rounds. Meisner rotated his defenders, keeping everyone in motion, creating the illusion of more men than actually present. At 1647 hours, the seriously wounded machine gunner Krauser died. Quietly, no drama, just stopped breathing. They left him in the foxhole. No time for burial, no time for grief. By 1700 hours, American activity decreased. Reorganization. Planning the next assault would be coordinated simultaneous pressure from east and south. Probably smoke to cover the bridge approach. Infantry rush to establish a bridgehead. Meisner gathered his men. 34 still combat effective. Ammunition down to 40%. When they come, he said, we hold until we can't. Then we fall back across the bridge. Blow the charges, swim the stream. The detonators in the river, Koller reminded him. I know, there were manual backup fuses, but somebody had to light them, which meant somebody had to stay. Nobody asked who. The Americans attacked at 2,100 hours. Smoke rounds saturating the eastern approach. Illumination flares turning night into false dawn. Infantry advancing in waves. First squad suppressing. Second squad moving. Textbook fire and maneuver. From the south, another platoon, moving through the forest, trying to reach the bridge's western side. Meisner's eastern line opened fire. Disciplined bursts, conserving ammunition, targeting squad leaders and machine gun teams. The Americans kept coming. Good troops, aggressive. They'd lost men at this bridge, and they wanted it finished. Westside Cleelers. 6 men engaged the flanking force. Heavier fire than expected. Americans had anticipated token resistance. Instead, they walked into a prepared position. The American platoon went to ground, calling for support. But Meisner's ammunition was nearly gone. 2,127 hours. Last MG-42 belt expended. Machine gunner switched to his rifle. 2,134 hours. American infantry reached 30 meters from the eastern defensive line. Meisner made the call. Fall back, cross the bridge. Now, controlled retreat. Each position covering the next. Rifles firing carefully aimed shots, making the Americans cautious even as the defenders withdrew. They reached the bridge at 2,141 hours. American infantry was 50 meters behind them. Meisner sent his men across first. Koller and his western team provided covering fire. Bullets snapping through the air. Tracers drawing lines through darkness. 34 men crossing a 47-meter bridge while American infantry advanced. It took 90 seconds. 90 seconds of absolute exposure. 3 men hit, 2 able to walk. One Jeffreiter, Paul Zimmerman, imprisoned for theft, took a round through the spine at the bridge's midpoint. Fell, couldn't move. Meisner ran back, American fire intensifying. Rounds sparking off the bridge's metal railings, chipping stone. Meisner grabbed Zimmerman's webbing, started dragging. Most commanders would have left him. Most commanders would have prioritized the mission. But Meisner had spent 3 years watching officers make calculations about which lives mattered. He dragged Zimmerman across. Took 14 seconds. Felt like 14 hours. They reached the western side at 2,143 hours. American infantry was on the bridge. Meisner ran to the demolition charges. Manual fuses. Simple system: light the fuse. You have 30 seconds. Bridge goes down. He knelt by the first charge. Koller grabbed his arm. I'll do it. You have family. Had family. Wife left in 43. Son died at Kursk. I've got nothing waiting. Meisner looked at him. This man court-martialed for selling Wehrmacht supplies on the black market. Sentenced to death by combat attrition. Now volunteering to die so his commander could live. Light it and run, Meisner said. You'll have time. They both knew he wouldn't. Koller smiled, tired, genuine. Herr Hauptmann, it's been an honor. He lit the first fuse. Meisner ordered his men into the forest. They hesitated. He screamed it. Move. They moved. Koller was lighting the second fuse when American infantry reached him. They shot him. 3 rounds. He fell across the fuse, body shielding it from view. The Americans didn't see it burning. Meisner was 40 meters into the forest when the bridge exploded. 4 charges, detonating in sequence. Stone and steel lifting upward, fragmenting the entire structure, collapsing into the river in a cascade of destruction. American infantry on the bridge. 17 men went down with it. The sound echoed through the valley for 7 seconds. Then silence. Absolute silence. Meisner stood there, breathing, listening to nothing. The bridge was gone. Koller was gone. And somewhere south, an American mechanized unit was closing in on a convoy that had run out of time. April 20th, 1945, 0600 hours. Meisner led his remaining 31 men south, not west, toward German lines. Those didn't exist anymore. South, following the route he knew the convoy would have taken. They found it at 1400 hours. 6 trucks, stopped on a forest road, American infantry surrounding them. No resistance. The convoy personnel, doctors, clerks, administrators, had surrendered immediately when the M4 Shermans appeared. Meisner watched from a hillside 200 meters away as American soldiers began sorting through the truck's contents. Documents, boxes of files, medical equipment, all the evidence Brenner had been trying to disappear. One American officer, Meisner, couldn't see his rank, was photographing everything. Another was speaking into a radio, likely calling for intelligence personnel. The documents would make it to Allied investigators, which meant they'd make it to Nuremberg, which meant the people responsible would have fewer places to hide. Meisner turned to his men. 31 criminals, deserters and thieves who'd just held a bridge against impossible odds for no tactical gain. No strategic objective. Nothing except keeping evidence from being destroyed. We surrender, he said, to the Americans. Together now, they walked down the hillside, hands raised, rifles left behind. The American troops were jumpy firefight nerves, expecting ambush. But Meisner approached slowly, calling out in broken English, "We surrender. No weapons, no fight." A young American lieutenant, couldn't have been older than 23, approached with an interpreter. "Who are you?" the interpreter asked. Meisner considered the question. Who were they? Wehrmacht soldiers, criminals, defenders of a bridge that officially didn't exist. Strafbattalion 999, he said finally. Punishment battalion. We were ordered to destroy Bridge 471K. We held it instead. The lieutenant looked confused. What bridge? The one that's not on your maps. 47 meters long, stone and steel, over an unnamed tributary. We held it for 18 hours. Why? Meisner nodded toward the trucks. So you would catch them. The lieutenant studied him, trying to decide if this was a trick or exhaustion-fueled nonsense, or something else entirely. You're saying you fought us, to help us? We fought, Meisner said carefully, to make sure those trucks stayed in Germany. The convoy's cargo was processed by Allied intelligence teams over the following 3 weeks. Contents included administrative records from Descartes' Medical Experimentation Wing, April 1942, March 1945. Personnel files for 847 concentration camp administrators. Financial ledgers documenting payments to 23 pharmaceutical companies for research materials. Correspondence between camp commandants and SS leadership regarding efficiency improvements. Transport manifests tracking movement of prisoners designated for medical experiments. 347 documents from this convoy were introduced as evidence at Nuremberg. They corroborated testimony, established chains of command, connected medical personnel to specific experiments. 12 individuals were convicted partially on evidence from these files. Without the delay at Bridge 471K, the convoy would have crossed into Austria, where the documents would have been destroyed or dispersed. Meisner couldn't have known the specific contents, but he understood the principle. Sometimes holding ground matters more than taking it. Here's what's strange. Bridge 471K doesn't appear in American after-action reports. The 11th Armored Division's official history for April 19, 1945, mentions minor resistance at various river crossings, but provides no specifics. No bridge designation, no casualty figures. No mention of the 17 men lost when the structure collapsed. German records are equally silent. SS Gruppenführer Otto Brenner was killed May 2, 1945, during the American advance on Munich shot, while attempting to flee in civilian clothes. His papers made no reference to Bridge 471K or any convoy. Strafbattalion 999's personnel records show 47 men listed as missing in action. Presumed killed on April 19, 1945. No location specified. No engagement details. The prisoners themselves were processed through standard POW channels. Meisner and his men were held at Camp Remagen. Released September 1946. Meisner's court-martial was reviewed. Conviction upheld the French civilians he'd refused to execute weren't enough to overturn a verdict. He was prohibited from military service. He became a school teacher in Hamburg. Died in 1989, aged 75. His obituary mentioned his Iron Cross. It didn't mention the bridge. Why the silence? Best explanation: embarrassment. The Americans lost men capturing a bridge that structurally failed, suggesting intelligence failures in assessing German defensive capabilities. Easier to omit than explain. For the Germans, acknowledging a penal battalion fought harder than regular. Wehrmacht units in the war's final days complicated the post-war narrative about clean Wehrmacht versus criminal Est. So Bridge 471K disappeared, not destroyed arrest. A battle that killed 23 people, delayed an armored division, and ensured critical evidence reached investigators. Gone from official history, but the documents traveled, and the trials happened. And 12 people who might have escaped justice didn't. That's not nothing. 14 men died at Bridge 471K. Not in the explosion 8, there the other 6 were killed during the day's fighting, or died from wounds afterward. Their names: Feldwebel, Ernst Koller, Jeff Reiter, Paul Zimmermann, Dieter Kraus, Hans Becker, Wilhelm Strauss, Kurt Adenauer, no relation, Franz Weber, Joseph Klein, Otto Schmidt, Heinrich Müller, Fritz Hermann, Erich Wagner, Georg Braun, Karl Fischer, criminals, every one. According to their service records. According to the courts-martial that sentenced them to punishment battalions. Also, the men who held a bridge so evidence of industrial murder couldn't escape justice. Both things can be true. 17 American soldiers died in the bridge's collapse. Their names are recorded at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg. They were listed as casualties of structural failure during combat operations. Technically accurate, incomplete. Meisner never forgot the count. 31 dead, 14 of his men, 17 Americans. For a bridge that officially never mattered, defending evidence nobody knew was there, ensuring trials that happened without his story being told. In 1983, a history student at Hamburg University interviewed Meisner for a project on Wehrmacht penal battalions. The interview transcript exists in the university archives. Near the end, the student asked, "Do you think it was worth it? The men who died?" Meisner's response, "I think they died making a choice. That's more than most of us got in 1945. Bridge 471K is gone now. The stream was rerouted in 1967 during highway construction. The forest was cleared. There's a rest stop there now, just off the A3 Autobahn between Regensburg and Pastor. Travelers stop for coffee, use the facilities, check their phones. Nobody knows that 14 condemned men held that ground for 18 hours. Nobody knows that their stand kept evidence from being destroyed. Nobody knows that the Nuremberg prosecutors who used those documents, who built cases, who established guilt, who made sure the world would remember what happened in the camps were working with. Material that only existed because a court-martialed officer threw a detonator in a river and decided orders from war criminals weren't orders worth following. History is a selection process. What we remember, what we forget, what we choose to record. Bridge 471K was forgotten. But the trials it made possible weren't. The evidence it preserved wasn't. The choice Meisner and his men made to be something other than what they'd been condemned as, that survives, even when the official record stays silent. Think about that. 47 men, criminals and deserters, facing American armor with rifles and for machine guns, fighting not for victory or survival, but for something simpler. Making sure the truth couldn't run. You don't need to be a hero to do that. You don't need to be innocent. You just need to decide that some lies shouldn't be allowed to escape. Meisner understood what modern analysis sometimes forgets. Individual actions matter even inside systemic collapse. One officer, one bridge, one decision. Not enough to stop a genocide. Not enough to prevent a war. Not enough to change history's arc. But enough to make sure evidence survived. Enough to make sure 17 defendants at Nuremberg faced documentation they thought had been destroyed. Enough to make sure the people who died in those camps were represented by something more than testimony. We remember the trials. We should remember the forgotten battles that made them possible. Not because Meisner and his men were heroes, they weren't. They were criminals given one chance to choose meaning over survival, and they took it. Because sometimes the most important battles are the ones nobody records. The ones that don't change the war's outcome, don't capture strategic objectives, don't appear in official histories. The ones that simply keep the truth from disappearing into Austrian forests and South American anonymity. Bridge 471K held for 18 hours. The evidence it protected lasted 79 years and counting. That's the equation that matters. Not glory, not recognition, not even survival. Just simple, brutal math. Truth preserved, minus lies escaped, equals justice that otherwise wouldn't exist. 47 men understood that on April 19, 1945, they held a bridge that didn't matter, so documents that did could travel. Most of them died doing it. None of them were remembered for it. The trials happened anyway. If this story moved you, if you believe courage like this deserves to be remembered, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. Sure, part of something special here. And subscribe, because we're just getting started uncovering these hidden chapters of history.